Hello, I'm Simon and welcome to the SciRob YouTube channel, and today it's going to be a video showing you how to change struts, shock absorbers, strut bearings, upper spring seats, all the components involved in the main front strut on a car. So let's crack on. It's quite a long video, but there's quite a few things to cover on it. So the starting best bit of advice that I can give you is to loosen the main shock nut whilst it's still fitted to the car. You may need a 7mm Allen key and a 21mm spanner, but with an impact wrench I just buzz it off nice and quickly just there. But if you loosen it there, it's a lot easier than trying to loosen it when the strut's off the car and you haven't got much purchase to work with. So basically everything needs to be undone at some point. So this is in no particular order, but I'm just taking off the anti-roll bar link. So you'll need a counter hold of some sort on yours. Sometimes it's an Allen, sometimes it's a Torx. On this particular one it's a 16mm flat that's around the near the ball joint on the anti-roll bar link. So I counter hold and then just use the impact wrench to take the nut off, and it's exactly the same at the bottom. So it's actually quite a nice and simple design, but can be a bit tricky to get the spanners in there. I prefer Torx or Allen counter holds, but there we go. So once the anti-roll bar link is off, that just pops out of the anti-roll bar and out of the strut as well. And then we move on to the other components. So on the strut itself, I'm just going to get the bolts loosened. You need large breaker bars, 1/2-inch tools, you know, decent stuff to get strut bolts off. They can be held on with, you know, years of rust. They're torqued up very tight in the first place. So what I try to do, even with an impact, is to loosen them a bit, then tighten them a bit, and then loosen them and repeat, because the build-up of rust can really cut into the threads and stop the nut from coming off. On this particular car, it's a 21mm for the nut and 18mm counter hold for the bolt, and eventually it comes off nice and easy. Then we've got the track rod end. So on this one, we use the impact just to break the initial kind of rust seal between the nut and the hub, and then eventually you'll need some sort of counter hold. So on this, it's an 8mm spanner at the top and then an 18mm spanner to undo the nut. I'm using the kind of the brake disc to help with the counter holding, but if you've got a brake disc guard like that, do be careful and make sure you bend the guard back. You don't want that rubbing against the brake disc afterwards. And then once the nut's loosened, it ends up coming off pretty easily, but you do need to use that counter hold to get it to that stage. So the track rod end just pops out of the hub, nice and simple, and then we just pop the nut back on so I don't lose it. And now go to the ABS sensor, which is tucked into the hub. On this particular car, it's a 10mm bolt. Nice and easy, shouldn't be crazy tight. I'm only using a 1/4-inch ratchet on this. But the sensors can end up being fairly stuck in the hub just through build-up of dirt and corrosion and what have you. So once the bolt's out, what I do is get the screwdriver in there fairly wide and just give it a little wiggle side to side just to start loosening up the sensor, and then hopefully you'll be able to pull it out. And because you're only pulling it out by the wire, you don't want to be putting too much stress through that. And then ABS sensors are normally attached to the strut in some way, just to keep the wiring out of the way, so that just needs popping off with a screwdriver. Then it's the drive shaft bolt in this case, or you may have a nut torqued up to a very high amount, in which case you're probably best to take the drive shaft nut off whilst the car's still on the ground, remove the centre cap of the wheel. Then I'm just using a wooden handle of my wire brush. You just use something softer than the metal of the drive shaft. Give it a good whack with a hammer, and that pops the drive shaft back into the hub. And I'm also taking off the brake caliper. I've got very detailed brake videos on my channel, so that's why I've not really gone into much detail on that. I've covered it, caliper removal, many times. So we just take the we just start loosening up the strut now. So just give the top bolt a whack, and that comes out, and then we just start loosening the whole area. So even though the drive shaft has been pushed back into the hub, it still may not come out very easily, so you don't want to just start yanking the hub off the drive shaft. You do want to be, you know, helping the drive shaft out slowly but surely, because you don't want to dislocate the drive shaft mechanism. Then we go back up to the top and start undoing the strut bearing nuts, and basically you can either loosen them all a lot or remove two of them and just leave one in place, just hanging on by a couple of threads, and that keeps the strut up and out the way, and it allows you to then get back down, hold the strut from the bottom, loosen the nut from the top, and then the strut will then drop down, and you can maneuver it out the way, and the whole strut is off. Now if you've bought quick struts, you know, or fully assembled struts, you just put the new one back on and that's it. But I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here for those of us on a budget who want to replace components individually. So the obvious one on this is the strut bearing, but also the bump stop is going to need replacing. So this is basically to show you how to disassemble the strut. I'm going to be using spring compressors, obviously. So you take off the top nut, then the bearing washer, and then the bearing itself, and it's that's done over 200,000 miles, as you can see, heavily corroded, distorted. If you were changing just the bearing, that's all you'd need to do. You don't need to bother with spring compressors. You'd put the bearing back on with the washer and put the nut on, and then just put the strut back in place. But I'm going to disassemble the whole strut, and then you can see the components. It does vary sometimes from car to car, but in general McPherson struts are made up of, you know, similar items to complete the package. So I'm just tightening up the spring compressor by hand at the moment, and I get it fairly high up the spring, not as far as it'll go, but reasonably high, so it's fairly close to the upper spring seat, and tighten it by hand, and then I just get my impact wrench on it. If you're doing it with spanners, it just takes a while because you have to do it bit by bit. So I give it a good blast on the impact wrench just to get it to take up any slack, and then I get the other compressor on, not exactly opposite but fairly opposite, and just give that a little tighten up to take up the slack. And then it's a question then of not overdoing, not tightening up either of the spring compressors too much. So think of it like climbing a ladder. You're putting one hand over the other, and so you do one compressor a little bit, and you do the other compressor a little bit, and slowly but surely the spring will compress, and it will relieve the tension then on the upper spring seat, and that will then allow you to take the star nut off. So I'll just keep doing that. As you can see, it's starting to compress the spring, but still nowhere near enough yet, and the spring ends up being pretty tight, and it's like a loaded gun. So the important thing as well is to make sure the hooks on spring compressors are nicely seated all the way through. You don't want any of the hooks starting to slightly pop out or anything, because if the spring lets go, you're looking at death or serious injury. So there's normally an official tool. It's called a star nut socket, which you put on, but I hate single-use tools and I avoid them if possible. So I have this, it's called a super wrench, and it just has many more purposes than a star nut socket. So I just counter hold with the 7mm hex or Allen in the top of the shock absorber, and then just start loosening off the star nut. And if you've compressed the spring enough, the star nut really isn't held on that tightly. So if you are struggling to undo the star nut, or you can see the spring moving as you undo the star nut, you need to compress the spring a little bit more. So now the star nut's off, take off the upper spring seat, and that is that's really knackered. The last 30,000 miles on that have just killed it off, because it actually wasn't that bad just a few years ago. But everything's just disintegrated on this now, so that's why I'm taking it apart, because I've ordered the parts, and when they arrive they'll be going on. So I thought I'd just do this video today just to show you the work involved and how you can change individual components, or you can change the whole thing. But if you want to do it on a budget, then changing individual components is better, but you do need the spring compressors, so it's weighing up costs of tools if you're not very well equipped with the tools. So yeah, so once that star nut's off, everything just comes apart really easily. Everything just flies off. And these shock absorbers, these have been absolutely fantastic. They're made by Melee, and I put them on about 5 years ago, and they cost me £88 for both of them. And they're still holding up absolutely fine. So even though they're not the prettiest, you're always going to get corrosion on shock absorbers and suspension equipment. These shock absorbers are absolutely fine, and they'll be going on. So when you're reassembling everything, the spring does have a dedicated seat at the bottom of the shock absorber, and you don't put it all the way to the end. You leave a very small gap, and this is how the bump stops and the bump stop cap should hold together within the dust boot. But that's how this should hold on. But as you can see, everything's just like in bits. So so that's why I'm fitting a new bump stop, new upper spring seat, and a new bearing to go at the top. And once again, for the upper spring seat, it's got a dedicated cutout that fits just right for the top of the spring. So you really can't get that wrong. It just doesn't fit right in any other orientation. Just trying to show you there how the upper spring seat fits onto the spring there. And then when you're going to be putting the strut back together, it's just all about taking your time and just doing it right first time, rather than trying to rush the job. This isn't a, oh, I'll just do the job after work. This is a, you need to allocate a day. If you've never done it before, you need to allocate a day to do it the first time. My first ever strut took me 5 hours, and then the second one took me about 45 minutes. It's just one of those jobs where, it just takes time to learn how to do it properly. So I just put the boot back in, then it was the bump stop, then the bump stop cap, then the upper spring seat, and then just tighten it up with the star nut. And once all that's in place, provided the spring is located correctly at the top and the bottom, you can then start undoing the compressors. Once again, don't undo them all in one go. You just do them bit by bit, one side, then the other side, and slowly but surely they'll loosen up, and then they'll just fall off the spring, and the spring will have seated correctly at the top and at the bottom, and everything will all be firmed up. So even though this strut's going to be going back on the car, this is for filming purposes. The parts were coming later on the day that I was doing this film, and so so I wasn't really going to, whilst I had the camera out, I thought, well, I'll just show you how everything goes back together, but it's just that the parts will be nicer. So once the star nut's back on, you then just put on your strut bearing, then the strut bearing cap, and then the nut to finish everything off. And if you've got an impact wrench, you can whack up the nut now, or you can do it up with the 7mm Allen counter hold, and in this case a 21mm nut. And that's it. So the strut's ready to go back on the car. On this, the flat side fits to the outside of the car, the outside of the wing or the fender. And that's the same on both sides. You can't really get strut bearings too far wrong in terms of putting them back in, because they're not symmetrical and the holes wouldn't line up. So, but just check when you're taking your strut off the orientation of all the bolts. So I've just stood up, just put it back in, put the nuts on. Don't have to do them that tight initially, but make sure you tighten them up later. And then this particular part of the job you could really do with about 8 hands. I bet an octopus is very good at doing this, because you need to kind of line up the hub into the strut, whilst at the same time making sure that the bottom of the strut isn't going to tear the CV boot on the drive shaft. You're also looking to turn the drive shaft and get the splines lined up so that it goes back into the hub at the same time. So I kind of get everything roughly lined up, and then if you just get the bottom bolt in of the strut, then once that's in, you can then start just gently moving things around. Just don't be rough with anything. If you've got an extra pair of hands, obviously it all helps, but you can see now the drive shaft was just slotting in nicely into the hub, and now I've got the clearance between the drive shaft gaiter and the shock absorber, so I can put in the top bolt and get everything tightened up. And after you've messed about with suspension, control arms, anything like that, inner tie rods, you need to get your alignment done, get tracking done, and then just do up the track rod end, everything in reverse order, tightening up all the bolts that you've done, and that's it, job done. And I hope you find that useful.